The following half-hour show is a paid political program and is not endorsed by this station, management, or staff.
The following program is sponsored by Excalibur Insurance Management Services.
We welcome to this week's show a national figure who has written articles for national magazines and newspapers like Newsweek, The Washington Examiner, The Washington Times, and others. She has been featured in the National Review, as well as Fox News, when she recently joined Kelsey Kohlberg to discuss what the network refers to as the indoctrination of freshman students via college orientation programs. She is Cherise Trump, no relation to the president. Cherise is the National Director of Speech First, a collection of students, parents, and alumni, which specializes in hand-to-hand combat against DEI departments in colleges and universities and their increasingly toxic censorship culture on campus. Cherise earned her undergraduate degree from George Mason University and went on to earn her master's degree in Security and National Defense Studies at Georgetown University. At Georgetown, she was a Rumsfeld Graduate Fellow. Over the past years, she has participated in a number of fellowships, such as the James Madison Fellowship, as well as the fellowship at the Claremont Institute. We look forward to discussing the issues with Cherise today and her organization, which is confronting and winning federal lawsuits across this country against universities for their violation of most of the Bill of Rights and the United States Constitution regarding equal protection and free speech, something we sorely need back on our college campuses.
This is the Volpe Report, a weekly news and political interview show examining the latest local, state, and national issues with Chuck Volpe. Insightful, informative, controversial, the area's premier political talk show, the Volpe Report.
Cherise, welcome to the Volpe Report.
Thanks for having me.
So my first question is going to be a simple one. Why don't you explain to our audience what is First Speech? You're the executive director now of First Speech.
Yeah, sorry, it's a Speech First, but no worries there.
Speech First, my mistake.
It's very easy to flip those ones around because obviously speech is first, and we want to embrace it as much as possible. And so our organization is a nonprofit membership organization where we litigate on behalf of our student members against universities that violate their free speech rights. So we also advocate for students' free speech rights and educate them on their legal rights, as well as keep them informed of looking at their campus policies and finding those red flags when they're wondering if their campus is actually violating their constitutional rights. So we've had a couple of recent cases against University of Central Florida, as well as University of Houston, and both of those were wildly successful because I think it's becoming very apparent now that universities are sneaking a lot of this stuff in, but really it only takes someone to call them out on it because it's very obvious that these policies are unconstitutional once you challenge them. But it's a matter of having that courage to step in and challenge them on it in the first place. And I think the courts are recognizing this as well. And this is something we hope to eventually get to the Supreme Court and settle the issue finally once for all.
Well, obviously, I've said to you personally, you're doing the Lord's work, and to keep it up. Let's kind of segue now. That's what Speech First is. Let's kind of segue. Mm-hmm. You are its chief executive director.
Yes.
With your fellowships and your background that the audience is fully aware of, and your talents, your erudition, if you will, how did you get to First Speech, and why did you accept that position?
Yeah, well, I have an unusual background in that it's in national security and defense policy, and
right.
That's something I went to school for, and I worked a lot with the Alexander Hamilton Society as one of my first jobs in Washington, and that organization is very similar to, I guess you would say, like Federalist Society, in that there are chapters on the campus, on your undergrad campuses, but that focus more so on foreign policy and national security, but we would bring in speakers to debate professors on various foreign policy issues. So that was my first exposure to what was going on the campuses, and if you kind of how you were treated by the administrative body if you had a conservative organization, right? Or how difficult it was to get that chapter recognized, and through the loop, the hoops that the administrators and the student government associations put in place to prevent conservative organizations from being recognized. And so that was kind of my first taste of what was going on campuses. And then I went further into the national security realm. But it became very apparent pretty quickly as I was working in this field that there was a bit of a disconnect between domestic policy issues and the cultural concerns that we all have with America and our future, and kind of like this hyper focus on defense policy and national security. So I wanted to essentially step back and take a survey essentially of what was going on around the country. And I realized some of the bigger issues that eventually will turn into national security concerns, because they will weaken us so much to the point that our enemies will take advantage of our weakening and our lack of culture and our lack of being able to come together around a lot of these issues. Our enemies are going to take advantage of that. So in looking at what's going on campuses, to me, that seemed more like the front lines of what we need to really be working on, and looking at free speech issues and what we need to be really working on with regards to the culture wars. So that's kind of how I ended up taking that turn from national security and defense policy into a more domestic issue.
We're going to get into something called BRS, Bias Reporting Systems, that you were quoted on liberally in the National Review, and its definition, which I'll let you explain in a second, but also the connection between, because my audience knows that I've educated them on DEI departments, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and the scourge they are on campuses and in corporate America and in the military. But you kind of pointed out to me the connection with DRS reporting systems, which are a subpart of DEI. So start with the definition and what is BRS, bias reporting systems.
Yeah. So bias reporting systems are very insidious, and oftentimes you won't know your campus has one until you report it to one, or until your friends are reported to one. And they are essentially an administrative process or system that exists on your campus. Sometimes it's an entire team of administrators. Sometimes it involves campus police officers as well. But they basically solicit anonymous reports from students on one another and on professors, or even professors can report students sometimes too, for various issues that they consider a bias incident, right? So a bias incident is usually defined in some subjective and overly broad way by the university. They'll use terms like offensive language or unwanted speech or joking, stereotyping, microaggressions. Keep in mind, what is a microaggression? Most universities will define it simply as something that something as simple as asking someone where they are from or why they're studying something or if they're in charge.
Oh my God.
So microaggressions are very easy to commit in the way that they're defined. So anything like that, by the way, all of this is versions of constitutionally protected speech. Yes, the universities will also say that politically biased speech can be reported, or offending someone's political affiliation, or even, we all agree that hate speech is inappropriate and uncalled for. But that doesn't mean that it's not protected by the First Amendment, because again, who defines hate, right? Who defines bias? Who defines unwanted? It is very subjective. It is not something that can be clearly defined. And the Supreme Court has held up that things like hate speech or bias speech or unwanted speech are protected by the First Amendment. So universities will solicit anonymous reports from students on one another on these various topics. And again, this is something that's very insidious, because you're like, why would they solicit these reports? Why do they want students to start reporting on each other? This does two things that are very, very dangerous. One is it creates an environment on campus and a mentality among students that they are each other's enemies, and they should be always watching one another and always waiting for one another to offend them so that they can report them. It creates like a tattling kind of mindset. This is something that we saw in East Germany with the Stasi, when they were trying to get neighbors and friends and family members to report on one another. Another thing that it is very concerning that this does is it keeps records, it investigates students, and it sometimes even disciplines them for their constitutionally protected speech. And so this is incredibly dangerous in that students don't know what records are being kept. They have no ability to face their accuser, because oftentimes they are anonymous reports, and they can be disciplined. Sometimes we've seen them have to take mandated diversity training when they're reported. We've seen them have to go in and speak with the dean. We've seen them have to write letters of apology. And so it is very creepy to how this is all going on campus.
It's
and
scary is what it is, Cherise.
Right. It is very scary, because these students are going to be taking this mindset, as you mentioned, they are going to be the future leaders, whether we like it or not. They're the ones with the college degrees. And as of right now, that is what gets you into leadership positions. So as long as we have a system that promotes and elevates people with college degrees into leadership roles, then we will be looking at these guys who have the mindset of essentially reporting on the people that offend them or that they disagree with to whoever they can, or keeping records on each other, they will be elevated to leadership positions. So that's the type of mentality that universities are trying to create right now amongst students.
You've now taken up the task of dealing with orientation programs for freshmen, because apparently the indoctrination right out of George Orwell's 1984, we should start calling our universities the University of Oceania. But having said that this indoctrination is starting in orientation. So be more specific and kind of elaborate on that.
Well, part of the reason we launched this investigation is because we wanted to know why students were so keen to report on one another. Why are they, like when I was in college, we weren't, even if the bias reporting system existed, it wasn't something that people would have used, right? So it would have been kind of uncool at the time. And so now you're like, why is it the cool thing to do is to report each other? Why are students so excited to report on one another? We've seen students report on each other for things like puke face emojis on social media, on a comment that they didn't like, or they get reported for telling a joke that offended someone. Someone got reported for standing next to someone who told a joke that offended someone and not reporting it. And they laughed at the joke, so they got reported. So this is something we were like, why is this happening? Why are students thinking like this? So we looked at how the universities are presenting these definitions of racism and diversity, equity, inclusion, microaggressions, and the reporting systems. How are they presenting this initially when students step on campus? And we looked primarily at freshman orientations. And we realized, so we sent freedom of information requests to over 50 universities across the country. And no surprise, they didn't want to be transparent, right? So it took a year, just to get information from them, and having to go through all these loopholes just to get them to provide us with the information we requested, even though they're publicly accountable to us, so they have to. But that's never stopped them before. So we ended up finally getting at least 51. I think we got 51 responses. And we found that 91% of the materials focus heavily on diversity, equity, inclusion, microaggressions, social justice, racial power dynamics, and all these various issues that students are very obsessive with right now. And that we found that only 30% of these universities even mention free speech or viewpoint diversity, which is something that we would expect to be very important and emphasize on a college campus where you expect a lot of debate and discourse, right? They rarely talk about open debate and discourse, and they really were hitting the students over the head with a lot of these kind of DEI notions, right? And so students, the universities are making an extra effort to plant seeds of insecurity where there are none before. And they want students to be looking over their shoulders, ready to be offended, ready to offend or to report whenever someone offends them, or report for someone else if someone else gets offended and they don't report. They want students to be mentally prepared for this. And so that is what the freshman orientations have been highlighting. We found that they make students take what are implicit bias tests. They have to go on surveys and click around matching skin color to positive and negative words. And if they do it too quickly, then they will be told that they are biased because it tracks your click rate. They have them do the same thing with transgenders. They also, for example, University of Nevada, Las Vegas has a list of definitions. And in their list of definitions, they define racism. And their definition of racism talks about how it's a hegemonic system that is designed to benefit white people. They specifically use white people in their definition of racism. So if you're a white student on campus, how do you think that makes you feel? You think everyone on campus sees you as an enemy. So this is just a small percentage of what's going on around the country because these were public universities. But we have a tip line on our website, speechfirst.org. So I encourage students to continue sending us these tips and use this as a resource to get these stories out for sure.
Well, I right here and now I'm going to say thank you for what you're doing on behalf of all of us that come from a different generation. In my case, multiple generations ago. What university life was supposed to be not crucibles of conformity and a collectivism, but in fact promoting diversity, but in the sense of diversity of intellectual thought, intellectual freedoms, free speech. The more you hear, even the outrageous stuff, allows you to formulate your own opinions, of course, Cherise, and find out what makes you inside who you are and what your belief system is and what your virtue system is. We're going to need warriors like you to keep the fight up. We're going to take a quick break, Cherise. As I said, I actually have a 3-minute view that will deal with some of the concepts that you and I are talking about, so it's appropriate for today's show. We'll be right back after this view, so hang on. Today's view deals with the miscreants that inhabit DEI departments at colleges and universities. You remember diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like a dread disease, they have metastasized into all facets of American life. They, along with their evil twin, BRS, otherwise known as bias reporting systems, which specializes in thought policing and turning one's fellow students into snitches, are raining tyranny and indoctrination on our campuses. Their woke ideology, censoring free speech and intellectual debate, their ruining of careers, have turned our universities into crucibles of conformity and censorship. Most recently, as editorialized by Pulitzer Prize-winning historian George Will, he writes of history professor James Sweet, who was also president of the American Historical Society. Professor Sweet wrote, and I quote, "Presentism, interpreting the past through the lens of the present, has permeated the teaching and writing history in academia. But doing history with integrity requires us to interpret elements of the past, not through the optics of the present, but within the worlds of our historic actors. However, the allure of political relevance is threatened if we don't read the past through the prism of contemporary social justice issues, race, gender, sexuality, nationalism, capitalism," end quote. As George Will points out in his editorial, Professor Sweet tried to say something sensible and succeeded. However, he had threatened progressive vanity, which celebrates oneself by disparaging historic figures like George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, and Winston Churchill, which in the eyes of woke ideologues were the moral inferiors of the woke academia complex. I will now conclude by quoting George Will directly. Quote, "Many academic historians writing history that matters fancy themselves heroes, fighting to overthrow systemic this and that. They yearn to have public consequence off campus in the political realm. However, today people engaged in the serious craft of politics are uninterested in the work of dilettantes who dabble at politics to the detriment of their vocation. These professors might ask themselves, why were less than 1.2% of Bachelor of Arts degrees awarded to history majors in 2019? Perhaps one reason for this is students are not interested in learning history from professors who are less interested in history than in playing politics, and understand politics as the activity of advertising their virtue in the sandbox of today's academia." Cherise, welcome back. It's been a very lively first part, and we've covered a lot. I got to tell you, I've had, as I said, governors and United States senators on this show, and usually my audience hears quite a bit from me along with the guest. I have, delegated to you a lot of the time because, frankly, your explanations are so good, they don't need any help. Once in a while, as a lawyer in trial, you get that expert witness that's so good, you don't have to say much. You don't want to distract them, you let them go, and I'm going to continue in that vein. I'd like to actually read a quote or two and then get your comment on it.
Great.
And this is from the National Review article on you and on Speech First. Here's one. First of all, about your membership effectively. Speech First is a collection of students, parents, alumni, and First Amendment lovers. It has emerged with a specializing purpose and single interest agenda to preserve free speech and open discourse in the lecture hall, on the quad, and in the term paper, and to do that by engaging in hand-to-hand combat against, quote, the increasingly toxic censorship culture on college campuses. I'd say that's a pretty good definition. Why don't you expound on that?
Yeah. Well, a big part of what we do is the litigation side. And so our members come to us and let us know when they think there's a policy on their campus that is chilling their speech or violating their free speech rights, making them afraid to speak up and express their viewpoints or their political positions. And oftentimes, I mean, it's always kind of been like this on campus where it's a majority liberal or left-leaning campus. And that's something that has always kind of existed in the last few decades. But conservative students used to be able to participate in debates, participate in lectures without worrying about it affecting their grades, their reputation on campus, without worrying that it's going to affect their career path afterwards. Now I'm seeing the complete opposite. Most of the time, with the students we work with do end up being conservative or libertarian because they're usually the most afraid to express their views because they're the ones that are targeted by these policies like bias reporting systems that we talked about earlier. They're the ones who are typically reported as either being racist or bigoted or offending someone's political position on an issue. And so whenever these students even hold just a mainstream opinion, they are ridiculed, and it's oftentimes put in a position where they might have to defend it to an administrator and let them know that these are my First Amendment rights. I can say these things. And administrators, if they don't feel like they're actually being put in a position where it's legally tenable, I mean, they might just make the student actually sign a letter of apology to whoever reported them. And again, students don't realize a lot of times that this is a fundamental violation of their First Amendment rights, that they should not be punished, they should not be investigated, and they should not have records on them based on their viewpoints and the things that they say. So oftentimes we do end up finding these situations where we are able to sue the universities and take them to court.
Everything you're saying about the horrors that students face in universities across this country, tenured professors in many cases face as well. I know I mentioned the case of a dean that had off camera had been let go, who was a friend of mine, for saying something so innocuous you wouldn't even believe it. But it turned out the DEI department took offense to that.
When people put policies in place in the name of diversity, they are often clouded by the fact that they get to shut down speech, that they get to discriminate against others, all in the name of diversity. And that's oftentimes what we see happen. It doesn't help any students, whether it be the minority students or the students being discriminated against. I definitely agree with you. It's a serious problem. We have seen this happening all across the country. I worry specifically about the Title IX rules that the Biden administration is proposing right now. The public comments are closing today on the 12th, and this is something that is now it's going to be reviewed, and all of the comments are going to be looked at by the Biden administration. But I can tell you right now, it was very likely these rules are going to be enacted, and the rules specifically make gender identity a protected class, and they also change how speech can be considered harassing conduct to the point where if a student wants someone to use their preferred pronoun and that other person, whether it be a professor or another student, decide not to do that, then that student with the preferred pronoun can actually report them for sexual harassment under the federal Title IX policy, and the university will have the federal mandate to punish them for sexual harassment, meaning expulsion, suspension, launching full-scale investigations, and obviously going back to what we saw a decade ago with the lack of due process with sexual harassment claims, these star chamber type trials. So this is what we're set up for. This is something that the Biden administration has been talking about for a long time, and they're finally going to get to do it. I hope there's some version of congressional review after the rules take place, but I'm telling you right now, we are going to see very soon, starting next year, compelled speech for the use of pronouns if we're not seeing it already on campuses.
Right. Well, it's scary. And now you're talking about, when you mentioned the Biden administration, you're talking about an administration that ordered its Attorney General, Merrick Garland, to list parents of students in PTA organizations as domestic terrorists because they were objecting to critical race theory and gender ideology being taught to third graders in public schools. I mean, so obviously this is just a continuation of, again, it's scary times, Cherise. Now, I'd like to turn quickly before we go. You're winning tremendous victories. I want people to understand you're not just an ideology that's challenging systems of oppression. You're winning in federal court and including circuit court, which, as you pointed out earlier, you're already half a step away from the U.S. Supreme Court. So I'd like to read another quote from the National Review. Speech First legal efforts have met with significant success because it has found two reliable friends: federal courts and the United States Constitution. 3 federal appeals court systems have come down hard on BRS as a tool of speech suppression and a violator of First Amendment rights. The quote from one, the Fifth Circuit: "The clenched fist in the velvet glove of student speech regulations," it decreed. Another one, "The implicit threat of punishment and intimidation to quell speech," said the Sixth Circuit Court of Appeals. These are the highest federal appeals courts in the land. So talk quickly before we leave about some of your successes.
Yes, yeah. So we also have recently had wonderful success against the University of Houston at the district level and the University of Central Florida at the 11th Circuit. We'll be arguing in front of the 4th Circuit at the end of October this year against Virginia Tech University. And for all of these, for the UCF and Virginia Tech and the ones you mentioned, Michigan and UT Austin, we were able to have very decisive wins there because we targeted policies that not only were applied to the entire campus, but our members told us about, again, these bias response teams, these harassment policies that target speech that are blatantly unconstitutional, but you wouldn't know they were there unless you were punished by them or your friends were reported. So again, they're not something that the universities necessarily advertise. That's why I encourage students to look into the policies on their campuses before they apply. But our success rate has been partly due to the fact that no one else is challenging these issues. So when we bring it to the court, it's almost the first time that they've heard of these issues. And so this is why we're like, this needs to be a national precedent. Our goal is obviously to get to the Supreme Court with the bias response team issue. But we also want to pursue it with the discriminatory harassment policy issues and the Title IX policy issues that we just discussed. This is something that it's very, very important that the public understands. Organizations like ours are not going to fall into this trap of mission creep. You know, we don't go off and try to do a bunch of things with the money that our donors give us. We don't try to appease a bunch of folks and a bunch of interest groups. We're not just a think tank doing a bunch of research. We are actually trying to affect change. We actually want to see through our long-term strategy, which is to go to the Supreme Court and to ultimately change the status quo of what's going on these campuses. And again, it comes down to being hyper-focused and hyper-decisive about where we want to be, getting those really strong strategic wins, and then following through and making an example out of the universities that we crush in the courts.
Well, again, well stated, Cherise. And let me say that it is my hope that your shining example will cause other organizations to form. I like your reference to a mission creep and getting too broad. You're laser focused on your target. It is my hope that other organizations pick up the ball and start in other areas, whether it's for professors and deans or whether it's on this new Title IX issues. You know how you win? You take them into federal court. Presidents can issue all the executive orders they want. The first thing they teach you in constitutional law in law school was that doesn't mean they're legal. Thankfully, we're still a country of laws. Cherise, thank you so much for your time. And you have stated things so well here for people to understand. You know, you're dealing with some somewhat sophisticated terminology. For a lot of folks don't understand this. So you've made it understandable, and you have clearly stated the battle lines are drawn and what is at stake for our future in this country. Godspeed on your work and continue great success. And I hope I have the ability to call you back on this show again as you achieve more victories and as other issues develop. You will be our resident expert. So thank you.
Happy to come back. Thanks for having me.
Have a great day, Cherise.
You too.